In one of the most prestigious private schools in the city, where children of the wealthy walk with pride and arrogance, there was one student who carried a secret shame: Daniel, the only son of a billionaire. To the outside world, he had everything: luxury cars waiting outside, designer clothes, and a last name that made teachers treat him with special care. But behind that privilege hid a painful truth: Daniel was failing. And before we continue, let me ask you, where are you watching this story from? Drop your country or city in the comments, I'd love to know. No matter how many tutors his father hired, no matter how much money was poured into his education, he couldn't pass even the simplest tests. His classmates mocked him quietly, some even laughed openly, whispering that a billionaire's son was dumber than the janitor who mopped their floors. It was humiliating, and worse, his father's disappointment was a shadow that haunted him every single day. Daniel's world was collapsing, and nobody, not even the teachers paid to care, had the patience to guide him. One evening, after another disastrous test result, Daniel stayed behind in the empty school hall, drowning in frustration. He slammed his books shut, ready to give up, when an unexpected voice broke the silence. It wasn't a teacher. It wasn't a classmate. It was the school janitor, a black man named Mr. Carter, who most students ignored or looked down upon. But what Daniel didn't know was that this man, who spent his days scrubbing floors, carried wisdom and secrets far greater than anything money could buy. Mr. Carter's sudden words startled Daniel. For a moment, he froze, embarrassed that the janitor had caught him sulking like a child. In Daniel's world, janitors were invisible people who existed only in the background, pushing mops and carrying buckets. He had never once imagined they could hold anything of value for him. But when he looked into Mr. Carter's eyes, he didn't see mockery or pity. Instead, he saw something no one else had shown him in years: understanding. Mr. Carter slowly walked into the classroom, carrying his old mop, his worn-out shoes squeaking on the polished floor. "You're not stupid, son," he said in a calm, deep voice that carried more weight than all of Daniel's tutors combined. "You're just learning the wrong way." That sentence struck Daniel like a lightning bolt. Nobody had ever told him that. Everyone, his teachers, his classmates, even his father, had painted him as a failure. But this man, the one society treated as the lowest, was telling him something different, something hopeful. Daniel wanted to brush it off, to laugh, to pretend he didn't care. But deep down, he was desperate. Desperate for anyone, to believe he wasn't hopeless. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously, his voice cracking with a mix of frustration and curiosity. Mr. Carter leaned on his mop handle, almost like a wise sage leaning on his staff, and whispered, "Because knowledge isn't just about books or tests. It's about how you see the world. You're trying to memorize answers, when what you need is to understand the secret behind them. That's how real learning works." The words shook Daniel. He sat there stunned. For years, highly paid tutors had drilled him with facts, charts, and endless repetition. Yet not once had they spoken like this. The janitor's words carried a truth that was both terrifying and liberating. Could it be possible that all this time, he wasn't the problem? Could it be that the system, the way he was being taught, was the real failure? Daniel stared at Mr. Carter in disbelief. A billionaire's son being counseled by a janitor, it almost felt like an insult. But inside his heart, he couldn't deny it. This man seemed to see him in a way nobody else ever had. And something in Daniel whispered, maybe, just maybe, this janitor holds the key to the one thing money can't buy: understanding. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Mr. Carter. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a janitor, he was looking at someone who might hold the answer to everything he had been searching for. His chest pounded, his palms grew sweaty, and a strange thought crossed his mind: why do I feel like this man knows something all the teachers and professors never could? Mr. Carter slowly set his mop aside, as if putting away the world's judgment, and walked over to one of the dusty desks. He picked up a piece of chalk and began to draw on the blackboard, not formulas, not words, but a simple circle. Daniel tilted his head in confusion. "A circle," he muttered under his breath. The janitor smiled knowingly. "Everything in life, son, is like this circle. Complete, connected, whole. But the way you've been taught, it breaks the circle into pieces and forces you to memorize them separately. That's why you fail. You're not seeing the whole picture." You're trying to hold fragments of glass instead of the full mirror. The room fell silent. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. For years, he had been drowning in broken information, bits and pieces that never seemed to fit together. And now, a man society looked down on was telling him that the problem wasn't him, it was the way the world had handed him knowledge in shattered pieces. Daniel swallowed hard. His voice shook as he asked, "So, what's the secret then?" Mr. Carter leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. "The secret, boy, is not to memorize answers, but to connect them. Life, math, science, language, they're all patterns. And once you see the pattern, you'll never forget. You'll learn faster than the best student in the room." Those words hit Daniel like an earthquake. Patterns? Connections? Nobody had ever explained it this way. He remembered the nights of endless flashcards, the tutors scolding him, the cruel laughter of classmates who called him dumb. But suddenly, all of it seemed pointless. The problem wasn't his brain. It was the lens through which he had been forced to see the world. Mr. Carter drew another figure, this time a triangle inside the circle. "See this? Most people just look at the shape. But the real genius sees the relationship between the circle and the triangle. That's what knowledge really is, the connection. You've been blind, Daniel, not because you can't see, but because nobody gave you the light to see with." Daniel's eyes widened. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of learning. He was hungry for it. The billionaire's son, who had everything money could buy, was now sitting at the feet of a janitor, desperate to learn one thing money never taught him: how to truly understand. And deep inside, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the moment his life would finally change. Maybe this janitor wasn't just cleaning floors, maybe he was here to clean the dust off Daniel's destiny. The next day, Daniel entered the classroom with a strange mixture of dread and hope. His mind was buzzing with questions he had never dared to ask before. Could this janitor, this man who swept floors and polished hallways, really teach him what no expensive tutor ever could? The very idea felt impossible, yet the spark in his chest refused to die. When he walked in, he found Mr. Carter already waiting, not with a mop this time, but with chalk in his hand and determination in his eyes. "Sit down, boy," Mr. Carter said firmly, as though he had been waiting for this moment his whole life. "We've wasted enough time. Today, everything changes." Daniel obeyed, though his heart raced. He had sat before countless private instructors, world-class tutors who charged more in a week than Mr. Carter probably earned in a year, and every single one of them had walked away in frustration. They had called him lazy, unteachable, hopeless. Some even whispered that he was cursed, doomed never to succeed no matter how much money his father threw at the problem. But now, here he was, facing the one man no one in the mansion ever noticed. The janitor turned to the chalkboard and scribbled down a math problem, a problem Daniel had seen again and again, a nightmare etched into his memory. His stomach twisted at the sight. "I've tried this 100 times, Daniel muttered bitterly. "It's impossible." "Impossible?" Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. His deep voice filled the silent classroom. "Son, the only impossible thing is the lie you've been told about yourself. Let me show you the truth." With a few deliberate strokes, he drew lines, arrows, and simple shapes that reframed the problem completely. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes widening as the chaos of numbers slowly turned into something clear, almost beautiful. The clutter wasn't random, it was a pattern, a story unfolding before his very eyes. "Wait," Daniel gasped. "You mean, it's not about memorizing steps? It's about seeing the connection?" Mr. Carter nodded. "Exactly. Math, life, success, it's all about connection. You've been chasing answers without understanding the story. Once you understand, the answers run to you." For a moment, Daniel sat frozen. His entire world tilted. For years, he had carried the crushing belief that he was broken, that he would never be smart enough, never be capable enough, never measure up. But in the span of a few minutes, this janitor had unlocked a door he didn't even know existed. The problem that had mocked him for years suddenly looked solvable. "Now you," Mr. Carter said, handing him the chalk. Daniel's palms grew clammy. The ghosts of his past failures clawed at his mind. You'll mess this up again. You'll embarrass yourself. You'll never be good enough. His hand trembled as he pressed the chalk against the board. But then, he remembered Mr. Carter's words, "You're not dumb. You were just never given the right light." With shaky breaths, he traced the same connections. One line here. A curve there. Step by step, he began to see what he had never seen before. And then it clicked. Like lightning striking the sky, the answer revealed itself. I did it," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling. His knees went weak as if the weight of his entire life had just been lifted. He turned to Mr. Carter, eyes wet with tears. "I solved it. I actually solved it." Mr. Carter didn't look shocked. His smile was calm, certain, almost fatherly. "Of course, you did. The truth was always inside you, son. I just wiped away the dirt so you could see it." And at that moment, something shattered inside Daniel, not his spirit, but the chains that had bound him his whole life. For the first time ever, he didn't feel like the billionaire's failure of a son. He felt alive. Capable. Powerful. The billionaire's boy who had once failed every test, had just solved the one problem that had defined him. And it was only the beginning. When Daniel returned home that evening, his mind was still racing with the thrill of his first real victory. For the first time in years, he didn't drag his feet through the marble hallways of the mansion. He walked with his head held higher, his chest lifted by a newfound confidence he had never known. But the walls of that enormous house were not forgiving, they echoed with the constant judgment of his father. And tonight, the judgment came quicker than ever. "Daniel," boomed Mr. Kingsley, the billionaire patriarch, as his son walked into the dining hall where chandeliers sparkled like fallen stars. "Your tutor called me today. Another failure? How many more thousands must I waste on you before you stop embarrassing this family?" His voice cut like a knife, each word dripping with disdain. Daniel froze. His hands clenched into fists under the tablecloth, the taste of humiliation burning in his mouth. Normally, he would have bowed his head, swallowed the shame, and sat through another lecture about being the family disgrace. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had tasted something new: understanding, power, hope, and it had all come not from his father's fortune, not from his tutors, but from the man his father barely noticed, the janitor. Daniel's voice trembled, but he found the courage to speak. "I didn't fail, Father. I solved it. Today. I finally understood." The entire room went silent. Forks stopped midway to lips. Even the servants in the background froze in disbelief. Mr. Kingsley narrowed his eyes, a mocking smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You? Solve something? Don't insult my intelligence, boy. Who gave you the answer this time? Which one of your high-priced tutors spoon-fed it to you?" Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears, but his words came steady, like a fire that refused to be put out. "It wasn't a tutor. It wasn't any of them. It was Mr. Carter, the janitor." The words landed like a thunderclap. His father's face hardened instantly, the color draining, then flooding back with fury. "The janitor," he spat, as if the title itself was poison. "You expect me to believe that a man who scrubs floors could teach my son what world-renowned professors could not? Are you mocking me, boy?" Laughter erupted from some corners of the room, snickers from relatives and guests who had always seen Daniel as nothing more than the spoiled, dim-witted heir. Their chuckles pierced Daniel's heart, but this time, instead of shrinking, he stood taller. "Mocking you?" "No, Father," Daniel said, his voice firm. "For the first time in my life, I actually learned. He showed me something none of your money ever could." The guests fell silent, stunned by the boy's defiance. Mr. Kingsley's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. Never in his life had his son dared speak to him this way. The idea that the help a man he paid to push a mop could succeed where elite institutions failed was an insult to everything he believed about wealth, power, and status. Yet Daniel's eyes burned with a light he had never seen before. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake, it was truth. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire felt an unfamiliar chill creep down his spine, fear. That night, long after the mansion had gone quiet, Mr. Kingsley paced his private study like a lion in a cage. His pride had been bruised in front of guests, his authority questioned by the very son he considered weak, and the source of that rebellion was not another wealthy rival, not some prestigious professor, but a janitor, a man whose name he barely remembered, whose presence he had never cared to acknowledge. With every sip of brandy, his fury grew until it became unbearable. So this Carter thinks he can outshine me in my own house? He muttered to himself, slamming the glass onto his desk. We'll see about that. At dawn, when the mansion's polished floors still gleamed with the janitor's nightly work, Mr. Kingsley descended like a storm. His expensive shoes clicked sharply against the marble as he found Mr. Carter quietly rinsing a bucket in the corner, sleeves rolled up, his face calm despite years of hard labor. "You," Mr. Kingsley snapped, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "I hear you've been filling my son's head with nonsense, pretending to teach him things you could never understand yourself."
Carter looked up, unshaken, his eyes carrying a quiet strength that seemed out of place in the shadow of such wealth. "I didn't pretend, sir," he said evenly. "Your son asked for help, and I gave it. Nothing more." That simple answer ignited Mr. Kingsley's rage. "Help," he barked, stepping closer, his presence towering. "Do you know how much I've spent, millions, on the best educators in the world? And you, a man who scrubs my floors, dares to claim you succeeded where they failed." Guests who had stayed overnight, drawn by the noise, began to gather around the balcony above, peering down in disbelief at the sight, the billionaire facing off against the janitor. But Carter did not shrink. Instead, he calmly set down his mop, wiped his hands on his worn uniform, and said words that cut deeper than any insult. "Sir, you've spent your fortune trying to buy your son's future. But you never gave him what he needed most, someone who believed he could do it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the maids froze mid-step, the entire staff holding their breath. Mr. Kingsley's face twisted, his ego bleeding under the weight of those words. "How dare you speak to me like that in my own home?" he thundered, his voice trembling with both anger and something far more dangerous, doubt. But Carter didn't back down. His gaze was steady, his tone steady but sharp as steel. "Respectfully, sir, this isn't about your home or your money. It's about your son. He doesn't need more tutors, more books, more pressure. He needs to know he is not worthless. He needs to know he is more than your disappointment." Every word struck like a hammer against the billionaire's carefully built walls of pride. The guests watching from above whispered in shock. Never before had anyone dared speak to Mr. Kingsley this way, let alone someone he considered beneath him. For a moment, the mighty billionaire stood paralyzed, unable to muster his usual weapon of scorn, because deep down, he knew the janitor was right. And as he locked eyes with Carter, what he saw there was not defiance, but truth, undeniable, unshakable truth, and it terrified him more than any rival ever had. The mansion trembled under the weight of silence, until suddenly, a voice shattered it, not Mr. Carter's, not the gasping staff, but Daniel's. The young heir, who had always kept his head bowed in shame, stepped forward with a fire in his eyes no one had ever seen before. "Stop it, father." His words rang through the grand hall like a thunderclap, making the guests above lean forward in disbelief. "You think yelling, threatening, and buying your way through life makes you powerful, but all it's made you is blind." Mr. Kingsley turned slowly, stunned that his own son, timid, always submissive, would dare confront him in front of others. "Daniel, what did you just say?" His voice trembled between anger and wounded pride. But Daniel didn't falter. He clenched his fists, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger with every word. "You spent years calling me a failure, a disgrace, someone who would never live up to your name. But for the first time in my life, I don't feel like a failure, because someone finally treated me like I was worth teaching. Mr. Carter didn't just give me answers, he gave me something you never did, hope." A collective gasp rippled through the room as Daniel's voice cracked with emotion, his words pouring out like years of buried pain breaking free. "You talk about power, father, but you don't know what real power is. Real power is believing in someone when the whole world has given up on them. Real power is kindness, patience, and faith. And you never gave me any of that." Mr. Kingsley's face drained of color as Daniel's defiance cut deeper than any insult. The guests, frozen in shock, could hardly believe what they were witnessing, the billionaire's son standing tall against the man who had ruled his life with an iron fist. But Daniel wasn't done. He stepped closer, his voice fierce, his presence commanding in a way that silenced even the billionaire's fury. "You can fire every tutor, buy every school, and drown me in your money, but none of it ever mattered. Because all I ever needed was one person to believe in me. And if you can't see that, then maybe it's not me who failed, it's you. The words struck like lightning, shaking the very foundation of the Kingsley empire. For the first time, Mr. Kingsley, the man who silenced boardrooms, controlled markets, and commanded empires, was left speechless by the voice of his own son. Above, whispers erupted among the guests. Did you hear what he just said? He stood up to his father, unbelievable. The atmosphere shifted, the weight of Daniel's truth pressing down like a storm about to break, and all eyes turned to Mr. Kingsley, waiting for his reaction. Would he erupt in wrath, or would the unthinkable happen? Would the unshakable billionaire finally crack? The air grew so thick with tension it felt as though the entire mansion itself was holding its breath. Mr. Kingsley, the untouchable billionaire, the man who had humiliated CEOs and crushed competitors without mercy, stood frozen as his son's words echoed like a hammer against steel. For a moment, his face twisted with rage, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white, his chest heaving as though he were about to unleash a fury that would tear the room apart. But then, something unexpected happened. His shoulders trembled, his jaw quivered, and his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that had stared down kings of industry, suddenly wavered with something no one thought possible: vulnerability. Gasps erupted from the mezzanine as guests leaned forward, whispering in disbelief, "Is he crying?" The billionaire staggered back a step, gripping the edge of a table as though the weight of his empire had suddenly collapsed upon him. All these years, his voice cracked, low and broken, so unlike the commanding tone that once made men fear him. All these years I thought making you tough, hard, unbreakable, was love. I thought pushing you until you bled would make you stronger. His voice rose, thick with anguish, his mask of arrogance crumbling before the stunned crowd. But instead, I broke you. I broke my own son. The room shook with silence so heavy it pressed into every chest. Daniel, stunned, felt his anger melt into shock as he stared at the man who had never apologized, never admitted weakness, never, ever, bowed to anyone. Tears streaked down Mr. Kingsley's face, his empire of pride shattering in front of strangers and staff alike. "And you're right," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of decades of mistakes. "It wasn't you who failed, Daniel, it was me. I failed as a father." The guests gasped again, some covering their mouths, others blinking in disbelief. This was history in the making, a billionaire's downfall not through scandal or financial ruin, but through the crushing realization of his own humanity. For the first time in his life, Mr. Kingsley was stripped of everything: his money, his power, his fearsome presence, left only as a broken man facing the son he had tried so desperately to mold into his image. And in that moment, the world seemed to pause, balanced on the knife's edge of redemption or collapse, because what Daniel did next would decide whether this was a story of reconciliation, or the final, irreversible fracture between father and son.
Daniel's chest rose and fell, his entire body trembling as if lightning surged through his veins. The sight before him was something he had never dared to imagine. His father, the untouchable giant, crumbled into something almost human, almost fragile. For years, Daniel had dreamed of this day, the day his father would look him in the eye and admit he was wrong. And now that it had come, it was both intoxicating and terrifying. The guests whispered frantically, their eyes darting back and forth, hungry for the son's response, as though the next words out of his mouth would determine the fate of not just a family but a dynasty. Some leaned forward, expecting forgiveness. Others smirked, hoping for a final rebellion that would topple the billionaire completely. Daniel clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his heart pounding so loud it drowned out every whisper. "You broke me," he spat, his voice shaking but fierce. "Every insult, every humiliation, every test you forced me to fail, it wasn't to make me strong. It was to keep me weak, so you could keep control. You didn't want a son, you wanted a shadow." The crowd erupted with shocked gasps, some even nodding as though they had long suspected this truth but never dared to say it aloud. Mr. Kingsley staggered again, the words slicing deeper than any public scandal ever could. Daniel's voice grew louder, each syllable fueled by years of buried rage, each word crashing like thunder against marble walls. "Do you know who saved me? Not you. Not your fortune. Not your so-called wisdom." His eyes locked onto his father's with a piercing, unflinching glare. "It was him." Daniel extended his arm, pointing across the room to the black janitor who stood frozen in disbelief, clutching his cap against his chest. The crowd turned, their jaws dropping, as if a hidden prophet had been revealed among them. "He treated me like a person, not an investment. He gave me respect when you gave me chains. He gave me strength when you only gave me fear. And because of him I am not your failure. I am my own victory." The mansion shook with murmurs, the billionaire's empire of fear unraveling not in boardrooms, not in courtrooms, but in his own living room at the hands of his son and a man he had never even noticed. Mr. Kingsley's knees buckled, his face pale as ash, his empire of power collapsing under a truth too heavy to bear. Guests whispered, some even clapping softly, as though history had just been rewritten before their eyes. And yet, amidst the chaos, the question lingered like a blade at everyone's throat: would Daniel offer forgiveness to a father who never deserved it, or deliver a final, merciless blow that would cut their bond forever? The silence in the grand hall grew unbearable, thick like suffocating smoke, as every eye locked onto Daniel, waiting for the son who once cowered in shadows to decide whether to bury his father under the weight of truth or to lift him up with the mercy he had never shown. Mr. Kingsley, once a man who commanded entire industries with a single nod, now stood trembling, a broken shell, stripped of the armor of arrogance, stripped of the power his billions once bought, and left only as a father pleading without words for something he had never given: love. Daniel's lips quivered as a lifetime of memories crashed like an unstoppable tide, nights crying alone and the cold glow of a failed test paper crumpled in his hands, days of cruel lectures about being unworthy, years of drowning under the suffocating belief that he would never be good enough, not as a student, not as a son, not even as a human being. And yet, interwoven with that pain were flashes of another kind of memory: the janitor's warm smile when he whispered, "One failure doesn't define you," the quiet hours spent learning in dimly lit corners where knowledge flowed without judgment, the feeling of dignity restored by a man society ignored. Daniel's heart thundered, each beat screaming war between vengeance and grace. The crowd leaned in, breaths shallow, their souls thirsting for a conclusion that would either destroy a dynasty or redeem it. Daniel stepped closer, his voice trembling but powerful, carrying the weight of centuries of sons silenced by fathers, of the oppressed dismissed by the powerful. "All my life," he said, his eyes burning with tears, "you told me I was nothing without you. But tonight, you've seen the truth: you're the one who's nothing without me. Without love, without humility, without respect, your wealth is just dust, and your empire is built on emptiness." A gasp rolled through the room like thunder. Mr. Kingsley reached out a shaking hand, as though grasping for redemption, but Daniel flinched back, the choice still raging inside him like fire against wind. And then, as if the universe itself held its breath, Daniel turned, his gaze locking onto the janitor once more. "You are the father I never had," he declared, his words slicing the air with a finality that shattered the billionaire's last hope. Murmurs turned to gasps, gasps turned to tears, and the billionaire's body collapsed into his chair, a titan finally crushed not by scandal or rival, but by the truth of his own failure as a father. The janitor stepped forward in shock, his hands trembling as Daniel placed his own hand over his, lifting it high for the world to see. "This man," Daniel roared, his voice now steady, unwavering, and resonant, "is the reason I stand before you with strength. He is the reason I am not broken. He is the reason I am free." Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then roaring, thunderous, shaking the marble walls of the mansion as though the very foundations of wealth and pride were crumbling. Mr. Kingsley wept silent, uncontrollable sobs as his son, the boy he once branded as failure, ascended before his eyes not as heir to his empire but as a man who no longer needed it. And yet, in the midst of that triumph, Daniel's final words fell like a dagger into the room's silence, piercing even the deepest soul: "You taught me that money is power. He taught me that respect is greater. You tried to chain me with fear. He set me free with wisdom. Tonight, the world will remember not your fortune, but your failure. And it will remember him not as a janitor, but as the man who raised a king from the ashes of a broken boy." The cheers shook the mansion until the chandeliers trembled, guests stood on their feet, some weeping openly, others clapping until their hands stung. And as Daniel walked away, hand in hand with the janitor who had given him back his life, the once mighty billionaire sat slumped, drowning in the ruins of his pride, knowing the greatest lesson he had ever taught was not through success but through his own downfall. In that moment, history was rewritten not in textbooks, not in boardrooms, not in ledgers of wealth, but in the living testament of a son who found his strength not from blood but from the dignity gifted to him by a man the world had overlooked.